This panel will explore the themes from the last 2 days, drawing together the challenges and opportunities that civil society faces and what we need to do as a sector to nurture a vibrant and effective civil society. I think we're really fortunate this morning to get some demonstration of what entrepreneurial people are doing to make it happen. I'll ask the panellists to move on stage as they're introduced. Joining us from over the waves is Josie Pagani, the Executive Director of our counterpart, the Council for International Development in New Zealand. Josie, welcome. She's going to be joined by Teela Reid, a proud Wurundjeri and Welwyn woman. Teela's amazing list of achievements includes being Australia's first female Indigenous youth delegate to the UNPF in New York, which inspired her journey to become a lawyer. She was a working group leader in the constitutional dialogue process that culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and continues to be a fierce advocate for First Nations, including taking on former PM Turnbull in a Q&A session, which some of you might have seen. Dr. Aqueel is our next panellist, who has 30 years' experience in the development sector, ranging from his early days at the UNHCR and Child Fund India to his work on women's economic empowerment. His passion to build capacity at the bottom of the pyramid has seen him establish the Association for Stimulating Know-How. And then we have Davaajargal Batdorj, the Director of Programs and Cooperation at the Mongolian Red Cross Society. Dava has been managing all program and project areas for the Society, including emergency appeals since 2016, and participates in the MRCS's regional strategic engagement in regional and global humanitarian strategy. And of course, our fourth panellist in the conference was selected as the People's Choice, Bronwyn Spencer from Uniting World. So welcome to all of you. Please join me in welcoming the panellists.
Kia ora tātou te whānau, ngā mia koutou ki te whare atu nei, tēnā koe, ki te tupuna, tēnā koe. Haere, haere, haere. E te kaupapa o te rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And that's how in New Zealand we start these events, by honouring the land that we're on, the first people of this land, and the place that we sit in, and the ancestors that sit behind all of us in this room. And if you were to translate that into New Zealand English, it would go something like this: G'day and thanks for coming. First of all, I just want to thank Mark and the ACFID team for bringing Council for International Development in New Zealand, and also, of course, Piango and Siali and myself all together, where we're modelling, I suppose, a localisation approach to the umbrella organisations, and it's really exciting, and there's lots more to come this way. So thank you for that. And so we really want to just get stuck into a conversation straight away, try and pull the strands of the many debates and discussions we've had over the last couple of days. What are the challenges that we face as international NGOs? How do we set ourselves up? What are the business models that we need to think about? What can we do now to prepare ourselves for the future? And, you know, we've got in New Zealand, we have a Pacific refresh, Pacific change. You've got a Pacific setup. We've got resets, refreshes, partnerships. It sounds like a terrible dance move, but you know, this is a great opportunity. And as somebody said this morning, I thought it was a perfect summing up. This is our moment of opportunity. So that's what this panel's about. No idea is off the table. I've given everybody permission to make us uncomfortable, challenge us, challenge each other, and so we'll get straight into it. So I'm going to sit down, but tell me if you can't actually see me. Slightly. So perhaps Aqueel, if we start with you, your organisation, the Association of Stimulating Know-How, has capacity development written all over it, doesn't it? And so is this the role in the future of international NGOs, to be capacity builders?
Thank you. I started my career and owe everything to Child Fund India. After finishing my college, I worked there for 5 years and then decided to quit and start Association for Stimulating Know-how. One of the reasons was that 200 NGOs we were supporting in India through Child Fund, it was realized that the knowledge and the skills were not reaching to the bottom of the pyramid. And because of lack of skill and knowledge not reaching down to the bottom, and with the assumption that the skill, knowledge, and information will flow from top to the bottom, that percolation theory was terribly wrong, and a lot of resources were spent in terms of with good gesture, good commitment, good passion, but the results and impacts were hardly to be seen. That's the reason that we felt that there's a need to really start building it from the bottom and start investing in the individual who are the first contact person with the community. And when I had read about the title about international NGOs partnership with grassroots level NGOs, it's about like moon and the earth. And when an email goes from Australia or from UK or from Canada to an NGO in India, it's like a tsunami in the NGO. Everybody starts preparing. Now we are going to receive somebody. We have to start cleaning ourselves, start decorating ourselves, start preparing ourselves because somebody from international NGO is coming to our grassroots level NGO. And with this reality and with this background, we are using the word partnership. So I would say that the panel and my role in today's discussion will be challenging some of the ground realities and how to face those challenges to really invest and structure and build those partnerships. And that's what ASK has been facilitating or trying to facilitate to really equip the institutions at the grassroots level to engage with other institutions in a partnership mode to have synergies and convergence so that better results can be achieved with less resources.
So maybe, Bronwyn, if our organisations are going to move into capacity development of our local partners, how is that different to what we were doing in the 2000s where capacity development was the big fashionable thing that we all did? Like, who is going to do the capacity development in this new world? Not necessarily us, so then what is our role?
We were lucky enough on Tuesday to have Dr. Khan come into our organisation and spend some time with us. And one of the things that we discussed is we're doing gender analysis with our partners. And so we discussed the mechanisms by which we were thinking we were going to operate. And Aqueel here basically asked us all the right questions, all the really uncomfortable questions, and turned our plans on our head. And one of the things that we've learned as an organisation is that capacity building, we often talk about it going to our partners. It's a one-directional thing. Capacity building needs to be mutual. We need our capacity built by our partners if we're going to be effective in partnering with them. And again, I pick up on your point about partnership covers a myriad of arrangements. And if partnership's going to be authentic, then we need to have our capacity built. And not just us, as I mentioned in the previous session, sometimes our role is to build the capacity of our sector and the donors within our sector so that our partners can do what they already know how to do.
So it's very much a transition of power and resources from, you know, the international NGO to the local partner. I mean, Tila, talking about that, how challenging that is, this is very political, right? You're coming up against vested interests in the status quo all the time. How do you navigate the politics of devolving to local partners or devolving to local communities?
First of all, I acknowledge country and I also acknowledge your acknowledgement of country. UNSW is on a very significant landmass. It was a men's meeting site. If you walk up UNSW, you can see you gradually walk up a hill, and it's a very significant to the Bedigal people. So I acknowledge that first, and that we are here meeting on unceded lands and waters. With respect to that, I am not going to pretend to be an expert in the NGO space. I am a lawyer, a publicly aided lawyer by day, but I've grown up in an activist family. So my view of politics and change is from that lens and from a very community, grassroots-driven lens. And it has been very difficult in this country to shift the consciousness of political ideology back to the centre. Australia is going to different extremes in terms of political views. And I think one of the things that I have learned through my activism specifically, and the example for a lot of people in the room would be in the last 2 years, the invitation at the heart of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, is the structure and strategy behind that process. One thing that First Nations peoples in this country have been incredibly good at is organising ourselves politically and socially. We wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. We are over 250 nations across this vast country. And and that's also the challenge for us, right? So there's many different nations with lots of different voices. So when we're trying to meet in the middle and find a purpose in our strategy and structure to create change, is hard, not just from a First Nations perspective, but from the perspective of trying to shift the power structures and institutions in this nation. With respect to Uluru, and I'll leave it at this point, with respect to the Uluru Statement from the Heart's call for a referendum to enshrine a First Nations voice, we know that mandate comes from the process that underpinned it. And the strategy this time in Australia from First Nations was very different to the strategy that was used with respect to past petitions or past statements. So if Australia was actually listening to First Nations, it would know that the Uluru Statement is not the first petition calling for greater say at a grassroots level in our communities. We simply want that protected. And the strategy behind that was gifting it to the people and creating a people's movement, not politicians. So that's where we're at with it.
So in many ways, the localisation agenda, which is what we call it, and it's devolution or it's subsidiarity, but it's another way of saying self-determination in terms of development. Red Cross, I know internationally, and in our region, have done a lot of research into how we're doing on localisation, and the conclusion is that we're very good at tweaking, we're not very good at transformation. Do you have any comments on that as a fine Red Cross representative? I mean, how do we move from tweak to transform?
Yes, that's a very important issue to raise. We have been talking about localization, local ownership, and strong leadership in the community level for so many years, but how do we translate that into the community level? So I would like to start introducing about Mongolia. How many have you been to Mongolia before? Oh, I see quite a lot of hands, but most of the people have not been. So I'm one of the 3 million population in Mongolia, and I'm representing a national local organization, which is Mongolian Red Cross Society, that has around 250 paid staff and more than 8,000 volunteers. So one of the biggest challenges that we have discussed yesterday was about the big power that is influencing the changing of humanitarian landscape, the funding mechanism, the donors are decreasing, the traditional funding is decreasing, etc. The first time I stepped into Red Cross, in Mongolian Red Cross, the few of the challenges that I faced was most of the people who are working in country was project-based. So depending on which donor is talking to them, they're implementing the project and was not coordinating among themselves. In other words, the internal communication was very low. So within, for example, one of the areas that we work is disaster management. So one person will be working in disaster risk reduction, but that person won't be communicating with the person with disaster response. So how do we tackle this issue without addressing this? So after that, a lot of things have changed, and it's really difficult to bring a transformation into an organization that is firstly big, secondly old enough. So our organization is 80 years old. So how do you bring change to that was a great issue. So within the movement and IFRC and our partners, we have been talking about localization, and within this area, they have been providing strong support. In terms of relationship, we have discussed this needs to be mutual, two-way relationship, and by building strength and good governance of the national society or the national organization, that can happen. So by saying this, it's not only it's like a rhetoric, it's like the tweet, but how did we did this is, when we first did like a public perception survey in Mongolia on how was Red Cross seen by the public, they have evaluated and conducted surveys all around the country and concluded that among cell phones and smartphones, Mongolian Red Cross was positioned as a Nokia. So it's still working, it's going well. However, it's not relevant enough, it's not up to date, but even if you leave it for 7 days, 10 days, the battery is still there, it's still working. So there needed to be a bit, our organization needed to change greatly, and I think that has happened for the past 4 or 5 years that we have worked greatly with our partners, and I would be happy to elaborate more later.
So yeah, one of the challenges is coordinating amongst ourselves, and of course the other challenge is who's doing the problem definition, who's defining what the problem is we're trying to solve. And I was very challenged yesterday by the wonderful presentation we had from the Timor-Leste ambassador, Ambassador Guterres, who said he fully expects Timor-Leste to be a wealthy country one day, and it'll be because they've got ownership over the oil and gas. So what do you do under localisation if your own values in your organisations are clashing, where you've got local people telling you this is their pathway out of poverty, and yet it's using fossil fuels where you might have another whole campaign going on against fossil fuels in the region? Aqueel, do you want to have a go at that?
Before I go that, I'll pick up 2 words, localization and ownership. I think these are very risky words. And India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the region, and Afghanistan, where we have been working, localization has been interpreted that you give so much space and you pull yourself back. That's not localization. That's not in the spirit of partnership. And that has happened where a total reversal happened where the local NGOs can start almost dictating to international NGOs what should be done and what should not be done. That's the other extreme. I think the whole strategy for localization is not defined. The intent is there. The feelings are there. Emotions are too many. But in terms of professional strategic visioning that how this localization has to be there and how it will be rolled out, that goes missing. And when this vagueness comes, and when we start discussing partnership and localization with vagueness, it creates a lot of confusion, uncertainties, and it works to the advantage of many, both the partners. So I think we have to be very, very, very clear that when we are even initiating this discussion, we are setting the expectations right. Are we really bold enough to keep the expectation right? Are we there to please each other, or are we there to really deliver and get the impact for which we have signed the agreement to deliver a common objective? When the emotion starts coming, feelings start coming, how do you feel about this partnership? It's not about how do you feel about this partnership. It's about how this partnership is going to work. So when we don't want to discuss the nuts and bolts, and because those are difficult areas, those are gray areas, those are upsetting areas, we may not be even prepared for it. And then we say, let's give space to each other. Space doesn't mean that we do what we feel like doing, because we have a common objective to achieve, and we have accountability standards defined upfront, both for Australian institution and the local NGOs. So I would say that maybe the other panelists can deliberate more upon it, that when we are talking about localization, what we exactly mean by it, and are we really prepared for it? Are we really ready to go deep dive into it? Because we are going to face a lot of nitty-gritties we need to be spelled out.
Yeah, so Bronwyn, what are the Who's doing the problem definition? I mean, if I look at the polling across all the Pacific countries, this is the UN polling about what is the concern that most people in communities have. It's a combination of jobs, access to health and education. Now, actually, climate change is quite far down there, which doesn't mean that they're not seeing all of those three things through the lens of climate change too, because that's a threat to all three of those things. But who's defining the problem in the Pacific that we think we're trying to fix with our partners?
So I think there's a number of different, I guess, pillars or streams in that. There is research. So we can refer to research that is done. We can engage with local civil society organisations and hear those voices. But then we've got to engage with the power relations and the power differentials as well. And so as a partnership organisation, as we call ourselves, and I hear you talking about, you know, move the emotion aside and let's meet our goal. We also do have, we work in relationship, and so it achieves that same end, because in relationship where there's trust, you can have the honest conversations and we can hear the things that we need to hear, and we can be told the things we need to hear. One of the things that I've learned through experience is kind of trying to break through to hear the problem, to break through the power dynamics, to sit on the mat and hear from women whose voices aren't in the leadership spaces, whose voices are on the side, and then kind of being a conduit to enable that voice to be heard.
So what I want to spend the next few minutes doing, and then we're going to throw it open to a Q&A session. So we know what the challenges are. We're not necessarily going to solve them in the next 10 minutes, but what are some of the models going forward that have been scoped in the last couple of days? You know, do we need to do more mergers? Do we need to rethink our business models in terms of the staff and the skills we have in our own organisations? I don't know. What each of you, I mean, maybe starting with you, Tila.
Yeah, I'll just add on from Bronwyn's point about what and how we identify problems, and I will share with the audience some of the things I have witnessed through travelling the nation and being invited to different First Nations. They are not talking about jobs or education or even health as concepts or priorities in their communities. They're talking about survival, about their land, and about access to water. Many of our communities are in extreme survival mode. I really don't think the average Australian understands how extreme our circumstances are in our own backyard. As a working group leader on Section 5126, the race is power of the Australian Constitution that enables our federal parliament to make laws to the benefit and to the detriment of First Nations. It was a profound experience for me as a young lawyer to stand up in a room like this before my elders and share my knowledge of that law, but listen to their stories about oppression, was a real awakening moment. Because they, in terms of trust and partnerships, aren't talking about, policies or whatever. They're talking about how they're survivors of massacres. They're talking about how they are survivors of stolen generations. They're talking about how this country still lives in denial of the truth. And in terms of shifting the power in this conversation in the country, Our elders were so selfless in gifting this nation the Uluru Statement from the Heart, because it wasn't a confrontational statement. It was a gift. It was, let's not struggle anymore. Let's walk together to create a better nation. And I think part of that, in terms of looking from my perspective at the NGO space, one of the things with the Constitution, and this is only one of many reasons, but one of the things with the concept of the entrenchment of the voice was to ensure that funding and decisions had longevity and sustainability amongst political cycles. So our mob are not constantly in survival mode to get the funding or the purpose or the community-driven actions that were always going to fall fatal to government decisions. And I think that's one thing with the concept of the voice and the sequence of the reforms was, let's work hard as Australians, let's do the hard work, let's not let politics determine the future of our nation. Let's rise up to the challenge that will be our next referendum to enshrine a voice, and not let politicians diminish the concept of what that reform will be.
So the business models that we need in order to respond, and I would say the politics of that play out in development absolutely in the same way. So perhaps to come back to this question of what are, in your views, maybe Dava, starting with you, what are your views of, what does the new business model look like? How do we need to structure ourselves? How do we need to look at what we do?
Like the documentary we watched yesterday, it came with a challenge and then came up with a solution, so everybody liked it. So when we talk about challenges, we need to come up with solutions, and that has to be real and applicable to ourselves. So based on the challenges that I have said earlier, there are a few good solutions. In terms of a civil society organization or like a non-government organization, to work for sustainability, we ourselves needs to be very sustainable inside. So when you talk about beauty, we say you have to be beautiful inside and out. So it's same. To be sustainable, you have to be inside and outside. So for the organization to be running sustainably and the core business is functioning well, we need to build our capacity. And one of the examples I need to bring in is one of our partners is Australian Red Cross. We have been working with them for many years. But for the past few years, they have been going through organizational change, and they're changing their business model and changing the way how they partner with organizations. And all of the process, we were included in it. So it was great to know like what are the changes and how we can take opportunity in that, and it was a great experience. So now what they're doing is they're supporting us in a way of funding, also supporting our core costs, which is giving freedom to us to implement whatever is necessary to build our capacity. So this gives a room to us to improve ourselves over the years. So this core cost model is to provide with us with a certain amount, and then over the years when you get stronger, it decreases, and in the end, it will be zero core cost, and the national society or the local organization is able to operate by themselves without being reliable on external funding. So this kind of partnership needs to be in place, which is mutually beneficial, and is a learning experience from both of the sides. One more thing I want to add is you have to be very loud, we have said, right? You have to be an advocate everywhere. 1 year ago, in 2018, we had the Asian Ministerial Conference in Disaster Risk Reduction held in Mongolia. And during that time, we're good in community engagement, so we have provided volunteers to the government, to the organization of the event, and we have visibility everywhere attending all of the events. So this is a good opportunity to show yourself that you are relevant. You're improving than the Nokia image to a smartphone. And this is the moment you need to actually utilize and be there, be someone valuable to whoever you're working with. So increase your value in whatever way you can, and then they will come to us. And all of this can be done locally, and the same goes with our partners.
Excellent. Aqueel, we've heard a lot from entrepreneurs today, looking at wicked problems and coming up with really creative solutions. Do we need to be a bit more like that?
So talking of the solutions, first is the word capacity building should not be misunderstood as trainings. A lot of money has been spent on training, so there's a difference between capacity building and training. The agenda has to be institutionalized, both at the international NGOs level and at the grassroots level institutions. So what do we mean by institutionalization? It's a jargon. It means that I have a dedicated vertical created with the human resource and budget allocations, with the business plan, with the tangible, measurable outputs and results of performance. And this partnership, by the end of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, should have the roadmap to clearly say what this institution, the grassroots level NGO, is going to build its capacity to achieve, to be in what kind of a performing mode, whether it's about sustainability, whether it's about subject knowledge, about skills or the knowledge. So at both institutions, and this plan needs to be jointly developed between the INGO and the grassroots institution, because it's a shared journey. But it should be marked against accountability and performance standards. So I don't know what happens when the international NGO staff return back to Australia office, who checks with them what input they have provided and what has been the output of that visit to India or to Nepal or to Pacific. And similarly, when the same question has to be at the grassroots level institution. So when we talk about institutionalization, we are talking of resource allocation, having the structure in place, having the competent resources and knowledge in place, having right people at the right position and at the right job, and also measuring it, monitoring it with very specific performance standards in place. Then only we'll be, and please don't misread capacity building as trainings. Capacity building is capacity building.
Excellent. Bronwyn, and it's quite hard to take a tin can down the road and ask for funding for capacity building, isn't it? I mean, how we are sustainable in the future if our job is different is challenging.
And I think that is one of the key challenges, because we've heard about, in this context, we sit under an aid budget that is defined by our national interest, our political and economic national interests of now. And then we hear from our partners, Reverend James, talking about reweaving the ecological mat and an ecological development framework by which we can engage in the Pacific in a localised way. And I think what INGO, the role that we have is to straddle that, to be able to support our partners to do what they need to do in the way that they need to do it, accountably, and bringing both skills to the table. But also our role then is to translate that back into the aid paradigm that we're in. And so that shifts some of our role as an INGO.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. I'm going to throw it open now to anybody who wants to ask questions. Please just say quickly who you are and what organisation you're from, and questions, please, not speeches, so we can keep it going. But yes.
Well, Chris Davaajargal, I'm an independent consultant, but I'm working on the joint appeals mechanism at the moment.
Excellent.
Picking up on Aqueel's point there about how do we as NGOs manage risk when our perspective of how to manage risk may be completely different from our partners and our donors. How do we align those differences together so that we can manage risk in an acceptable way to our partners without using the hell out of the people that we're working with who may be working in different paradigms?
Not to mention our donors.
Alignment. If we are not aligned, the things are going to go wrong. There is going to be waste of resources. So the different nomenclatures, for me, I'm the only guy here who works in India, live in India, attending this conference. And for 2 days, it was so interesting to know how Australia and the Pacific relation and the whole orientation is happening. Similarly, when this knowledge goes to the partner, the difference of understanding is huge. huge. And that's a risk in itself. We assume that what we are speaking, they are understanding. Let's eliminate all assumptions. We hardly, it doesn't percolate, it doesn't go. So it has to be, we have to ensure that that alignment has taken. So the definitions, the terms, the discussions has to be in very simplistic term. It has to be two-way, as rightly mentioned, and then alignment has to happen. Where the reality check happens, can this be done or not? You have an expectation which may be beyond my capacity to even deliver. That's where the first risk starts. Or you have a mandate which I will not be able to deliver in next 18 months or next 18 years unless certain inputs comes in. And that's where we define our respective roles and our boundaries, respective boundaries. And if we have roles and boundaries defined, I hope the alignment will happen and that will mitigate the risk. It cannot be eliminated, but it can be definitely mitigated.
Yeah, good question. Any others?
I hope I answered the question.
I mean, it's very hard when we're all doing due diligence for our donors too, and the expectation is huge. Is that same expectation going to be transplanted to our local partners? I mean, it will be virtually impossible. Yes. I think the question was, define localisation, basically. Yes, great, thanks. Dava, you want to start?
Okay. Well, we shouldn't be using the term localization because it's already happening. And we need to understand the term correctly by everyone so it can be implemented. So it's basically having more freedom, having the table of your own. If we say our organization's strategic direction is somewhere there, we need to sail there. So the driver or the sailor of our boat is the local organization where NGOs and our partners are seated there to help us support to get to our goal. So I believe that is localization. And in Mongolian Red Cross Society, what we did to overcome the internal disorganization is we organized ourselves into programs where, for example, we have a disaster management program where all the components of the disaster management is included and everyone is talking to each other and have one direction to actually go to that is identified mutually by themselves. And after that, we have organized partnership meetings with all of our current donors and partners, and also potential partners. So that time we explained and communicated what we want to do. This is what we actually want to achieve, and this is in the best interest of the local people and the community because we know better about the local context. And by that, we discuss with them, we figure out the way how we can work together. So for our organization, we see partnership as not a threat. For some discussions yesterday, it was saying that Chinese influence is coming in. It's one of the threats, and how do we trade in? Do we actually should do multilateral cooperation or not? But we see everything is an opportunity, so you need to communicate what you really want and then discuss on how you can achieve a similar goal.
Perhaps that's a good question to ask everybody here, actually, if anyone wants to have a go at it. Is it localisation to set up one of your offices in country? I'm not going to name any organisations, but does anyone want to have a go at that? People are shaking their heads. Brahman or Aqueel or Tila, I mean, is it local to just set up a branch of your organisation in country? Go, Brahman.
I've got to say no, and that would be, I guess, our approach. And the idea, if you look at the partners and the countries that we're supporting, they have strong civil society organisations. Now, we partner with churches. Churches are at the national level, the regional level, the community level. They're engaging with families at the family level. there's no office that we can set up that can do that. And one of our partners in Vanuatu kind of said to me once, confrontingly and honestly, you know, we are born here, we live here, we will die here. Why are you making our decisions? And that's, I mean, and we, I guess, we talk about a localisation agenda. Whose agenda? And I've even heard the terms rolling out our localisation agenda.
In the field.
Well, we've got to
that
think through some of that.
We can keep digging into that because I think that gets to the nub of it really. Any other questions around that? Or any other questions? Yep.
Is that working? My question's around in spaces where civil...
Just tell us who you are.
Yeah. Rebecca from Australian Mara Solidarity. In spaces where civil society has been constricted or punished or are finding it really difficult to operate politically and socially, what can we do to make sure that the voices are heard and empowered without putting people, you know, at increased risk?
Aqueel, do you want to have a go? I think the question is really, is it our job, do we have a role in amplifying the voice of those where space has been restricted? Is that a future role for us, a greater role for us?
Sorry, I couldn't hear it properly, so I can't answer.
Did anyone?
No.
Tila, do you want to have... Do our NGOs here have a role in amplifying, advocating, amplifying the voice?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly with the movement and the journey I've been on in the last 2 years. I was just talking to an elder recently. So essentially what happened post Uluru was just no funding, no money or anything. So we've been basically on an unfunded journey to disseminate information to the Australian people. And some of our greatest supporters in disseminating that information has been NGOs, civil society groups, men's groups, women's groups, and not just, you know, left-leaning groups, but right groups and those that consider themselves centre. And in my view, they have been so extremely important at endorsing the position and the self-determination of First Nations. So not overemphasising their role in the movement, but being willing to... They've been the first kind of organisations to go, yep, come on board, let's see what your story is, we will endorse it. Because one of the actual hardest things has been getting the coalition of groups or organisations where you are powerful entities to come forward and assert endorsement for a movement like the one I've been on. And I think they're important in amplifying the voices, yes, absolutely, particularly in an unfunded campaign that we're on now.
Yeah, that's a very important question when we are talking of scenarios in India and neighboring countries. I'll talk in that context. Basically, many institutions now are being challenged in India, from where I come, where they feel that the local, and the word localization, I'll come to that also, it's not a local voice, it's an international voice. And as soon as that message goes across the government and the civil society, it creates a lot of turbulence. I heard today the minister and yesterday criticize government, be bold, speak. You say that word in India, you are behind the bars in present scenario, you know. So amplifying meaning that, and the word localization, I would use the word ecosystem. It's very important to understand the ecosystem. The DNA of the ecosystem need to be understood. And for international NGOs, the challenge is you work in different countries, different social, economic realities, different anthropological phenomena exist, talking of gender analysis in one country to the other, and countries which are big like India, China, where you have differences in, in various sectors. So I think it's not about localization, it's about, for international NGOs, it's about understanding the ecosystem, going granular, going deep inside to understand the ecosystem. But that won't be possible with 3 days visit, 5 days visit. flying visits. That won't be possible. How is that possible? And claiming that I have that understanding will be difficult. So that's where it becomes the role of your local partner to help you make that understand. There has to be an honest discussion and conversation. I don't know how many partners from India will really raise their hand and say, please don't use the word advocacy right now, it's a sensitive time. But you say, no, the budget I have is only for advocacy, so you have to do advocacy. Both are in big trouble, both are in big trouble. So please, with regard, so when you amplify, how do you amplify? You build my capacity, you help me to amplify it. So the discussion has shifted. The paradigm shift is talking about advocacy, lobbying is to be, the front runners has to be the local institution, and that too not NGOs, has to be the community, the members of our community. We have really forgotten about our primary stakeholders. Local grassroots NGOs has become as big as an INGOs. It becomes their territory. They don't allow community to even speak in various meetings and conferences. They feel they can be the mouthpiece of the community. No. We were just supposed to be facilitators. So I think it's important we remind ourselves the basic fundamentals. The primary stakeholders are the community which are at the grassroots level, and we all are just the facilitators in putting the whole processes and resources in place so that we can help them, enable them, capacitate them, or empower them to help themselves and achieve the development objectives.
We have a Minister of Foreign Affairs in New Zealand who is from the north of New Zealand, poor community, he's Māori. He understands development in terms of regional development because it's what he's done for his entire political career. And he would never go into his own community and tell them what to do. The first thing he'd say is, what do you need? What are the opportunities? Who are the problem families? I'll go around and see them. So we use these words, don't we, in development, like localisation, capacity building, sustainable livelihoods, and really some of these concepts are applicable domestically in a common sense. So,
can I just add to your point, sorry, but both of your points, when I'm thinking about your example from your minister in Aotearoa, one of the things we're finding with this concept of what we are aiming for a First Nations voice in Australia is we are getting now this messaging from Leafy Canberra about diminishing the voice or what potentially a model could be because they want it to be more localised and regionalised without the structural change. And that's one of our challenges as we identified the problem of this power imbalance between our First Nations peoples and this dialogue between the Australian people and the government is that there's always this rhetoric around Indigenous issues that Indigenous people can't solve their own problems or they are the problem or the lowering the expectations of what we're aiming for. And what we're seeing now is this movement from Parliament going, well, let's just talk about the localised stuff. Let's just talk about the regional stuff. But in Australia, which is very different to New Zealand, is we have really complex structural, political and legal issues. So if you look at the foundation of New Zealand, it's very different with the Treaty of Waitangi as opposed to here where we have this written rule book that not many Australians understand how it works, which is also part of our campaigning dilemma as less than 3% of the nation, is as we traverse the country, we're also trying to inform really well-meaning Australians that, about their own system and how it works and why there's this structural problem and this disconnect between Canberra and local regions.
Yes, so local can't be a way of avoiding the structural changes that need to happen. Mark. That'd be good, Mark.
Some years ago, Indigenous organisations in Australia, AMSANT and ACOS, or the Alliance, basically argued that Indigenous NGOs should be preferenced in government contracts for service delivery against non-Indigenous NGOs, and there was a pressure for NGOs in Australia to sign up to that charter. Some years later, at the World Humanitarian Summit, the NEAR initiative was launched, which was the initiative by Southern NGOs on localisation, and their catch cry was, don't give us more capacity building, give us 20% overheads in the grants from donors. So I think it was actually a pretty clear message. It was actually about money and resources. And I think this goes to the heart of the power imbalance, because in our sector, as long as we are the mediators of the money, we have the power. And I think it's been very wide-ranging and expansive discussion about localisation, but that was the essence of localisation in the World Humanitarian Summit. And I don't think we've made much progress on that. And it's not for want of discussing it, but because it goes to the heart of giving up power.
And letting go of power is really hard, yeah. Yes.
Multiple nations and representing different societies, and this session is, I think, the main focus on civil society and the civil and individual and myself, etc. So I just want to ask from the panel, we all talk about civil society, the civil society organizations, etc. Who actually represents the civil populace? And the interests of the civil populace, the people like me. Who are civil society organizations? Who checks and regulates them? Especially in a context where we have competing elite interest and the popular aspirations. So,
Dava, do you want to have a go at that? So the question really is who are civil society organisations? And I think in some ways...
I've just finished. I just want to finish.
Yeah.
In the context, where we have organized societies, where this problem is there, in America, elite interest and popular aspirations, and of course in fragile and chaotic societies, where I come from. So, you all are talking about civil society. So who is civil society? Are you guys civil society?
And are you also talking about language? Like we tie ourselves in knots going NGOs, private sector. Meanwhile, people in the Pacific aren't necessarily making that distinction at all.
No, I think in the conference you've talked about for whom it really matters. We've talked about the funding thing where our space is being constrained. But then we've also talked about capacity building, empowering, all this kind of thing. So I just want to ask the civil society, in your opinions, and in your work areas, who are the civil society? How do you identify
I think that's a very important question and a representation issue. If we talk about the place I come from in that region, the whole movement, the whole Sarvodhian movement which started was led by people, by the society. And then later on, it got structured in form of organization. And then a stage came when the people from various disciplines started coming after taking their formal education and started forming NGOs and it became a profession. Finally, there were degrees in universities, sociology, anthropology, social work, and people mainstreaming. So there has been a whole evolution of the whole structure. But the fundamental remained the same, that you are representing the people. It's never you. You are always representing the voices of the people, of the grassroots. But that has got diluted to a very large extent. It's my own beliefs, my own perceptions, which I can be talking or representing what I believe in. So the golden rule has been that, and that's where there is a distinction now between CBOs and CSOs, community-based organization and civil society organization. Where are those CBOs gone? Where the people were being organized and they had the formal representations on the institution. Legally, you may have the law for your registration and for your accountability, but backward linkages is with the society. When you talk about capacity building, and that's good you mentioned this, because it's not about capacity building of institutions, It's not about capacity building of CSOs. It's capacity building of the community. So that's the reason when started career, every year, twice I used to fly internationally and got a lot of paid trips to many countries, But what I'm taking back to the community with whom I was working. So when we talk of capacity building, it has to be the model which is investing at the bottom of the pyramid. It means in your communities. So all training institutes, training calendars, fee for training, bringing different people in one room and doing training is questionable. I have questioned that 30 years back. It has to be that we have to go to that ecosystem, adapt and align, mitigate the risk, and work at that situation where your input goes to the people and not to the institution. Never assume that if you're training the NGO managers and governance, it's going to go down to the people. No, it won't happen. It's proven. It won't happen.
We had a wonderful, very famous comedian in New Zealand as our MC at our last conference last year, and he's a New Zealander of Tongan descent. I said, hey, will you come and do the NGO conference for international NGOs? He went, yeah, sure. What's an NGO? So,
It's an NGO, yeah.
interesting, right? Some questions? We've got a time for a couple more, I think. Anyone who hasn't asked questions, yeah.
Oh, hi. This is a question for Tila. Melita Grant from Institute for Sustainable Futures. Thank you very much for sharing the journey so far. Just wondering, you mentioned the important role that NGOs have played so far in the journey. What pointers do you have for this audience? A lot of organisations here do work domestically as well as internationally. So are there any other points that we can take from your experience and drive the Uluru Statement from the Heart forward? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think when I speak to elders in this movement and, also non-Aboriginal people who believe in the movement and who have committed their activism to the movement, we get asked this question a lot, and I'm often reminded that this moment in time is like a moment in time Australia has never seen before. We haven't had a referendum for, I think, over 20, almost 30 years. So what that looks like these days is very different to the last test we had as a nation. And there are no rules to this. But one of the things I think that panellists have spoken about is the power in building capacity. And I think with NGOs who have committed and signed up, my advice is just to, as the politics develops in the next term, is to reassert your position and resist any diminishing of what the form of recognition would be. You all have the mandate, that is the Uluru Statement, and I was going to ask Josephine if I could just finish by reading that to inform our international audience about what really I've been talking about, and for those who haven't heard it here in Australia either. So do you mind if I read it?
Yeah, in the spirit of localisation, Tila and I had already discussed this. We're going to read the Uluru Statement. You're going to read it, and then I'll ask Bronwyn to say a final word, and then we'll close. Thank you.
We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise that peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reform to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the Australian people and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our vast trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Mengdanguru.
Kia ora, Tila. Kia ora, tautoko for you. Tēnā koe and kia ora. Bronwyn, I'm going to call on you because we haven't heard from you during the question time to do a very quick summing up. What would be one thing that you would say to our colleagues here? What is the first thing that you would call on them to do towards localisation, towards the future?
I think we need to stop talking and speaking for the voiceless. I think we need to pass the mic. And we need to reflect on the colonial underpinnings of our sector, and that's the place to start.
Brilliant. What a good way to end. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for a really dynamic debate and discussion, and it's one that we'll keep doing, I know, as a sector for a long time to come. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking.